All right, and our second lesson this week is called Cellular Transport. So we're learning how things are moved in and out of the cell. Here we go. More than 100 years ago, something interesting was discovered. If blue dye was put into the bloodstream of an animal, tissues of the whole body except the brain spinal cord would turn blue. To explain this, scientists propose that a blood-brain barrier exists that prevents material in the blood from entering the brain. Now we know that the blood-brain barrier is a highly selective membrane that separates the circulating blood from the brain. Similar to the blue dye, molecules have many different ways of traveling into and out of the cell, depending on certain factors. And like the blood-brain barrier, plasma membranes of all cells are selective in what they let in and out. In this lesson, you will be exploring these cell transport processes because they are a foundational component of how the body functions. And so here we have a picture of the brain, and we have the membrane, which is, I believe it is the dura mater, which means tough mother. It's this thick coating that keeps the brain in. And then under that, I suppose, is this membrane, with small molecules being able to come in, large molecules needing a transporter. In this lesson, we're going to identify plasma membrane structures and their respective functions. We're going to identify factors that will impact the movement of materials across the plasma membrane. And we're going to compare and contrast cellular transport processes and describe active and passive processes that move material across the membrane. All right, so we got a lot to learn. Here we go. Simply put, cellular transport is how material moves into and out of a cell through a cell membrane. So far in this course, you've learned about the components of human cells, how proteins are made, and how cells replicate. Now, we will take time to think about what materials might need to move in and out of the cell and how. Make some initial predictions about why each molecule travels by filling out the hypotheses below. Don't worry if you don't know the answers quite yet. Try to make some initial hypotheses on what you know. Okay, particles from the food I consume likely move. So I'll pause and I'll let you complete this. All right, yeah. So into, out of, or both into and out of the cell. The cell's particles from waste or garbage, my cells generate likely move. Which direction? To help the cells, maybe, what do? Clear waste. And then water moves which direction to help the cells do what? Hormones likely move. And why? And we'll move on from there. The broadest categories of cell transport. We have two main ones. A good thing to take notes on here. Passive and active. One doesn't require energy and one does. Taking a look at the diagram to the right, one shows leaves falling and the other shows putting leaves into a pile. Which represents passive transport and which is active? So leaves are just going to naturally fall down to the ground due to gravity, but putting leaves into a pile requires energy from you exerting force onto the rake. That force ultimately was able to be generated from glucose that you broke down in your cells to make ATP, which ultimately came from plants that took it from the sun through photosynthesis. Just a little review there. So I'm going to pause and take notes. How things move in space, as seen in everyday life. How are molecules transported in a cell? It may be helpful to explore how very simple items move naturally in space. There are universal laws that predict where items will be depending on the surrounding environment. Pick a real-world situation to consider. When candy gets dropped from a jar, when bad smells leave a room, or when ice melts in your drink. Let's just go with the first one. Onwards. When candy gets dropped on the floor, if you drop the candy on the floor, what's the result? Will they get more organized? Will they become scattered? Or will they keep the same organization? Maybe it seems like a silly example, but it's interesting to observe it at a macro level as we dive into a micro level. So things tend to move from high organization, order, to low organization or disorder. This is called entropy. Entropy in chemical and physical terms is typically defined as a measure of disorder. what would be required to put the now scattered and disordered candies back in the jar? So you need to put energy back in, right? That would be like you picking them up and putting them back in the jar. Exactly, and the same thing applies to a smell in a room or ice melting. Naturally, a smell in a room will spread and ice will melt. No matter how you may go about it, putting the smell back or putting the ice back into solid form will require some form of energy. Increasing entropy. Where do materials move? In the entropy examples earlier, spilled candy, a bad smell in a room, and ice melting, you saw how things move from an ordered state to a disordered state. We call this change an increase in entropy. You can start to recognize patterns in how things might move in a closed system, like these compartments pictured. The membrane between compartments A and B is permeable to blue dots. A membrane is permeable to material if that material can freely pass from one side of the membrane to the other. Over time, what will the distribution of blue dots be in both compartments? Select a response. Okay, so if they can pass over the membrane, that means from compartment A, in an organized state, all of these molecules here are going to move to separate out. So compartment A is on the left, compartment B is on the right. Let's see. Compartment B will always have more dots than A. Not necessarily, right? They're trying to move towards equilibrium, where there's both even numbers on both sides. Compartment A will always have more dots. Nope. Without adding energy, compartment A or B will have approximately the same amount of blue dots. So eventually they're going to move towards being equal. Oh, and there's a second question. In what direction are the blue dots moving? Select a response. To areas with equal number of dots, from an area of fewer dots to more dots, or from an area of more dots to fewer dots. So they're moving from more dots to fewer dots. You've learned so far that with no added energy, things tend to move towards disorder and towards areas with less concentrated things. Materials, particles, and molecules is what we're generally calling things here. So, is there an end point to things moving, such as the point they stop moving and just freeze in space? According to this principle called Brownian motion, which is named after the person who discovered it, particles that are suspended in a fluid continuously move at random. This results from their collision with other particles, atoms, or molecules, aka things, in that fluid. So they're bouncing around, they hit something, they move. That happens randomly. Remember that liquids and fluids are not the same. Liquid describes a state of matter like solid and gaseous. A fluid is a substance that flows. For example, nitrogen gas is a fluid, and orange juice is a fluid and a liquid. And that's a little technical detail there. So according to Brownian motion, what do you think may happen once things are spread out in space? Will they move to lower concentrations? Well, they're already moved out, right? So they stop moving? Nope, they're just going to keep moving, Brownian movement. They're not necessarily going to become ordered unless we add in energy, but they are going to keep moving randomly and not to higher concentrations. Cool, so I'm going to make a note of that in my notes. All right, so solutes, solvents, and solutions, they greatly matter in anatomy and physiology. Let's quickly refresh on some introductory chemistry concepts, which will help you understand the next section of the lesson that we will cover passive transport. When a solute dissolves in a solution, when a solute dissolves in a solvent, they form a solution. Okay, so I add something into something that's going to dissolve it, and that forms a solution. I'm going to take notes on that. Let's work through some examples. Identify the solute, solvent, and solution. For example, in sweet tea, you maybe have sugar that you put inside the tea, and that forms the sweet tea. Or in salt water, you have salt. You put it in water, and that forms the salt water. So solute plus solvent equals solution. I'm going to write that down. Okay, so now for diffusion. Good morning. Inside this coffee mug is a liquid, some coffee, And the smoke coming off the top, it's not really smoke, right? It's not carbon dioxide produced from a fire, but it's the heated particles evaporating, forming a gas, changing state. We would call this a fluid. It has a way of moving. It has a flow. So the gas is a fluid. The coffee is a fluid because it's a liquid. Fluid can describe anything that flows. That's a quick little tidbit for that lesson. Now, which direction is this moving? Always moving kind of from high concentration to low concentration with a dynamic equilibrium. Always moving. Something's always happening. And it's always tending towards equilibrium, an equal state. We go from high to low so that it becomes equal.